Hi, thanks for joining this live broadcast made possible by Enterprising Nonprofits Canada. My name is Michelle Strutzenberger and I'm with Axiom News, and we're excited to partner in producing this show. We hope you'll be energized, that your thinking will be expanded, and that you'll gain some takeaways you can apply in your work right away. But you don't just have to watch. If you have questions or comments, you can tweet us using the hashtag ENPOnAir. That's #ENPONAIR. Or you can share your comments and questions via the comments section and the Q&A app on the Google page that this video is hosted on. We have folks watching all those pages. And now over to my colleague, Patricia Marcocha.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm Patricia Marcocha, also with Axiom News, and very excited to be hosting this conversation called Scaling Up Social Enterprise today. We have a lot of interesting material to cover, so we're going to get right into it. We're joined by 4 wonderful guests today, 2 consultants and 2 practitioners. We have Abe Grindle, a consultant with Bridgespan Group, joining us from New York City. We also have David Upton, a team member with Common Good Solutions, joining us from Halifax, Nova Scotia. We have Vanessa LeBourdais, the executive producer of DreamRider Productions, joining us from Vancouver, British Columbia. And we have Heidi Lambie, the regional development manager for 2 Restore social enterprise locations in southern Alberta, and they both support Habitat for Humanity. And Heidi is joining us from Calgary, Alberta. So to set the frame for this conversation, I'm going to read an excerpt from an article called The Folly of Scale, written by Robert Egger. We're going to post this article on the Google Hangout page for anyone that's interested in reading the full piece. So in this section, Robert is referring to the pioneering generation of modern philanthropy beginning in the 1960s. So Robert writes, I saw many of these early leaders build bigger and bigger organizations, and when they retired, the board couldn't afford to hire another leader. They had to hire a manager to keep the machine moving. Instead of the machine solving the problem became keeping the machine alive. In DC, I worked in the biggest shelter in America, 4,000 beds under one roof. It was a model that people applauded and funded in 1985 because it was going to scale, but now we know that scaling shelters was the exact opposite direction we should have pursued. He continues, some big things are worth making bigger. I love big art galleries. I love big parks. I'd like to see the bike culture grow and the sharing economic model. I'd like to see big cures for ugly illnesses. But what I don't dig is the universal thought that all programs need to show how they'll go to scale. I'm just trying to get folks to stop for a minute and really think about what we need to grow and how we grow it before we send another generation into the trenches thinking that success means making the trench even bigger. So to begin, I'd like to invite each of the 4 guests to share with us why was it important for you to be part of this conversation today. Whoever would like to start. If not, I'll pick someone. David, would you like to start?
Skype pauses.
Okay. I think we're just having a sound issue, David, with your microphone.
Yeah, no, sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay.
I muted it and then forgot to unmute it. My apologies. I conclude with thank you for listening. Okay. The social enterprise experience. This interests me because our experience in the Atlantic region of Canada has been with social enterprise mostly rooted in community, with a number with a number of notable exceptions. Sector organizations have stayed small and mostly committed to their communities. So this part of the country has a long history of working together to build broadly supported solutions, social and lately environmental issues. And while I see the value of that sort of less is more kind of thing, I also see some of the limitations. So we did a survey recently of nonprofit social enterprises in Nova Scotia, and we had 1,100 organizations. We actually got interviews with, I don't know, 220 or 230 of them, And our sales from goods and services were somewhere around 175 or 180 million dollars, which compared fairly well with the wine industry in Nova Scotia, the wine industry in Nova Scotia. And what was interesting about it is that in the social enterprise sector, and this was broad across all sectors, or all parts of the sector, there was about 4,500 jobs created. In the wine industry, with roughly the same revenues, it was 860 jobs. So in this part of the country, employment, and particularly employment in rural communities, since we're the most rural part of the country, is important. So how do you? We're really interested in the idea. I'm really interested in the idea of how do you scale ideas as opposed to organizations, because I think excuse me, in lots of ways the organizations already serve a critical purpose by staying small. So that having been said, our credit union, as it becomes larger and stronger, starts to centralize functions, and I've been a credit union member for many years, and my credit union is now very much like the bank I left to go to the credit union. And so, I mean, the profits go to a different place, but in terms of their function, and I think that's a natural progression, you know, for organizations as they grow. They tend to want to streamline work activities, and there's both good and bad to that. So those are my interests.
Okay, thank you, David. Is there anyone else that would like to jump in? Okay, Vanessa.
Okay, it's hard to jump in when you know you'll talk over top of each other.
For sure.
So DreamRider Productions started as a small theater company doing environmental education of young children, and we found Vancouver area where we reach about 50,000 kids a year now. But we were finding that what we were doing was really working to change kids, like actually fundamentally change children, and they were changing their parents. And so we started looking at how could that thing that we're doing work for elsewhere for other people, which is also known as scaling. But I liked your introductory paragraph, because the quote that you read, because one of the things that really interests me about scaling our impact is how to do it without really scaling our company very much. Because I personally don't have very much desire to run a giant organization. Fundamentally, I'm an artist who ended up running an organization. And I want to do more art, not more administration. So that's been a really interesting balance for me. And so I'm really interested in the conversation about scale. I love the framing that you've put about how to do it in a way that actually makes sense, because a lot of what I've encountered has been bigger is better, and I keep thinking that's how we got in the problem that we're at in the world. Fundamentally, is this idea that growth for growth's sake is the end, and if you're a bigger company, you're therefore a better company, and you should have more honor and status. And I think that there's a lot of stuff around that's in the way of actually doing the right thing. So, and I'm really interested in hearing this cross-cultural conversation as well. I mean, the cross-country, international even, with Abe conversation.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. Definitely a lot of the literature has been talking about these topics, so that's great that there's resonance there. Heidi, would you like to jump in?
Sure. We're a little bit different in the fact that the restore concept for Habitat for Humanity is international. It became international just this past year, going into Australia and Ireland. So it can get bigger, but you can still remain very local. And I represent just southern Alberta, so there's two different restores here. Calgary, which is a multi-million restore, but then we also have a Medicine Hat restore, and it's still very intrinsic in the community. So you can have a large-scale social enterprise, but still become very small and very community-oriented. So our scale is very different.
Okay, thank you. We've had one of the questions come in from the Q&A actually already applies to some. This was Jeff Madigan who asked, does anyone have experience with a social enterprise model that has 20+ locations or franchises? So definitely your work applies there.
Yes, it does.
Abe, if you can share with us what brought you to this conversation.
Yes, happy to. It's my pleasure to be here. So my name is Abe Grindle, and I'm a member of the consulting staff at an organization called the Bridgespan Group. Bridgespan is a nonprofit advisor and resource for mission-driven organizations and philanthropists. We have 3 offices in the U.S., but we work both domestically and internationally, so it's really a pleasure to join. And the topic, I think, is just so important because, as we all know, the need out there in the world is incredible. It's vast. It's far greater than our best efforts to date. And so this question of scale, for us, it's about, how do you scale impact rather than organizations? And how do we scale? Really, the question now has become, how do we scale impact to a degree that is commensurate with the size of the need that exists? Or how do we scale impact to a magnitude that actually solves problems? So we don't pretend to have any answers, but we're excited to be able to learn and engage with leaders all over the world that are working on this, including this group. So looking forward to the conversation very much.
Thank you. It's certainly very exciting to have so many people engaging in that very question. At least it's a question. It's a first step. Vanessa, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about where you're at with DreamRider Productions now. You've had a lot of success with the program, and I know that you're looking to scale up. So if you could share with us some of the things that you've been thinking about and considering as you prepare to scale up, and also what your vision of scaling up actually looks like, what that means for you.
Sure. So as I said before, we're a theater company, and we started as 2 actors doing shows for the city of Vancouver on water conservation, littering, and recycling. And now we really saw, as I said before, a need in the community for engagement around environmental change in behavior, because a lot of the programs that are out there for kids aren't actually engaging as, say, SpongeBob they're used to. So we started looking at how can we scale theater. Well, the first thing we knew is that theater has no margins. Therefore, the idea of scaling it is kind of a nightmare unless you can charge, I don't know. So we started by making videos, but children look at them passively. And we realized that while it might engage their minds, it wouldn't engage their being. In our shows, in our live shows, kids are screaming and singing, and they're like full-bodied, excited, engaged in the performance. And so we spent a couple of years
Okay, looks like we may have lost Vanessa, the joys of the internet, unfortunately. So we're going to hope that we bring her back so we can continue that, but maybe we'll jump into another question. Heidi, I'd like to ask you about your experience of scaling up, especially in the last year when one of the restore locations in Medicine Hat was moved to another location 7 times as large. So I'm wondering if you can share some of the insights that you've collected over the last year, and also what it's meant for staffing and for sales, and also especially for social impact.
Certainly, thank you. You know, this project of moving our Medicine Hat restore was over a year. So the first thing is getting the right skills of people in there to tackle any business plan. And so, you know, we had to look at that first of what we needed to do. And this store was so under performing because of location. And when I look at our social enterprise, I go in on a business perspective. You have to spend money to make money, but you also have to do it correctly. So even our board member wanted to shut down the Medicine Hat store because he was embarrassed because that was the last performing restore in Canada. But we proved to them that location is the top priority, just like running a business. So our insight in moving that was, A, definitely getting the right staff. I had an excellent store manager that could handle this move. We worked collaboratively. Open communication is crucial, especially since we're 3 hours away from Medicine Hat where I work. So that is definitely an obstacle, distance. Working with a timeline and an Excel spreadsheet that gave us all the little finite points that we had to make sure that we were taking care of. Little things like land title and permits, making sure that we're going to the city at the appropriate timelines. One thing too was when we got closer to moving the store, we bit the bullet and decided to close the store. So sometimes to close an operation for short-term losses is a long-term gain, and that being it really helped out with our staff not being overworked and injuries, because it was a very stressful time. The one thing that I can say that was a huge asset was finding a commercial realtor that was vested into our cause. He understood what our needs were, what we were about, and he negotiated a fabulous lease that was very supportive of our budget, and being a nonprofit that we couldn't, afford a great deal of rent. Going into this larger space, it took time to figure out how to map up the store into our departments, appliances, home building supplies, windows, furniture, plumbing. And, it's going to be your best guesstimate, but you need to really do your homework. And then when you have that mapped out, figuring out the jobs that need to be done. So we, in the smaller place, had 1 full-time store manager and 2 part-time people. When we moved, we kept with that, knowing that we had to hire a 3rd part-time person pretty much right away. But we have ended up now, we're in this location now for a year, and we have 4 part-time staff, still 1 store manager. We increased our store hours to be open 5 days a week. We used to be 3 full days and 2 half days. So just the labor requirements definitely were a huge impact for us. And there again, getting the right fit of people who can accommodate what we need. But we saw great benefits immediately. Our sales skyrocketed. On average, we're doing 57% more in revenue than last year in the same time frame that we were in when we compare the smaller store space to the larger store space. We will exceed our budget by this month, probably. And the awareness of our brand, can't really measure that except for the fact that when people have come into the store, they would say, well, finally, there's a Restore in Medicine Hat, and we would have to tell them we've been there for 7 years. So we've been around. It was just really hard to find us. And in finding the right location, too, what is important is, talking to your staff, your volunteers, and your customers. What we found, or what I found with our customers, that they were a lot coming from out of the city, out of province, because we're very close to Saskatchewan from Medicine Hat. So finding a location that was easily accessible to them was huge. We have, and kind of directing to the question from Jeff there, because we are an international organization and the Restores have been in existence for over 20 years, we do have a framework that we work off of. And so there's great resources that we have and matrices that we go off of. So our support is phenomenal from international as well as Habitat Canada in how to go about opening a new store or moving a Restore. Just to go back also in regards to touching a little bit on the social impact, not only about awareness, but the Restores are great in diverting product out of the landfill that's usable. Sometimes it's just great to, it's brand new because we have commercial partners that donate new products. We have people who donate older products but still usable. Just to give you an example, in 2012, when we were still in our small location, we diverted about 89 tons of product. In 2013, we've diverted 133 tons. And to date, as of the end of June, we've already diverted 125 tons. So environmentally speaking, our green footprint is getting larger. So yeah, hopefully that answers everything that you had asked.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I want to bring Vanessa back in since we unfortunately lost you in the middle of your conversation there.
Yeah, so just briefly, I'd continue by saying we did manage to create a program, a digital interactive classroom program called the Planet Protector Academy that we launched in February of this year after several years of testing and development. And at the same time, we were developing our organization from very small administrative team to improving our systems, and these were all things that I had had to learn from scratch. I think now we are just ready to scale. Our program was in 20 communities in Ontario and BC this spring in schools, which sounds like scale, but it was just 3,000 kids, and compared to our 50,000 live audience, that for us is just the beginning of scale. But we feel like we now have our system set up and staff in place to grow. One of the key components for us in this is the understanding of funders of the requirements of scaling a social enterprise, because often those requirements aren't very sexy. Like right now we have to do some back-end upgrades to our website, the program website, and there are a lot of funders who are just not interested in that because it's A, not a new project, B, it doesn't sound very exciting, C, they can't go, yes, we funded a back-end upgrade, woohoo. So, but there are some spectacular funders, like I'd just like to name Van City Community Foundation and Van City Credit Union have been really behind us 100% in terms of their support in our growth, not just as a funding partner, but as a real partner helping us to grow and develop our business plan and all that kind of thing. So I think that's actually really key, is finding partners who understand social enterprise and the needs of it. And personally, I think the other piece is going from us being a small, just a few people, to a larger company, is the personal growth that I have had to do in order to step up to be the leader that the company needed of me. And that was a lot of going through my own resistance to, like I said, managing a larger company, and my own inner blocks, I would say, to feeling like I could do it, or learning the skills, increasing my financial capacity, and that kind of thing. The increased complexity of our operations, and of course finding the right staff is really important to that. So we fortunately have just hired an awesome right-hand person for me, so we're looking really forward to the growth that's going to come. But it has been interesting because we are really wanting to keep the company culture that we have. We have a great company culture between the 6 of us who are now in the company, and I look at that as part of our success, is that we have a great dynamic in our team, and our values are really strong, and so we're really looking at how we can keep those values strong even as we continue to grow and add people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to bring in a question that's just come in from a viewer, Joe Godin. He's asking, what is the indicator or the indicators that it's time to scale up a social enterprise? And it seems that it's more complex when you're talking about social enterprise. So for you, Vanessa, in this experience, what were some of those indicators?
Well, the early indicator was the radical changes that we were making in children, and then seeing other programs that weren't in other parts of the country that weren't having the same results. I mean, just for example, in our Planet Protector Academy, we're getting 65% of parents driving less, and we heard from another organization that does similar work to us that the sort of industry standard is about 4% change for environmental education. So that's an indication to me this is needed. We need to take this. The other thing is that the demand was growing. actually a year and a half ago, I really was like, I can't do this. This is too much. I don't want to grow. And it just grew anyway. We just started getting interest, and it's like, well, too bad, Vanessa, you're going to have to learn to manage with this growth, because we started getting interest from across the country. So yeah, there's the interest growing, and there's that what you're doing is working in a way that, but I think also the other piece is organizational readiness, the capacity to handle the influx of growth, like having the systems ready, having the processes in place, having your team ready to handle the influx and the increased volume of demand, I think is really critical.
Okay, thank you. It seems that the growth found you, you didn't find it, and then you had to get prepared for that.
Exactly.
It's interesting to look at a lot of these different models of scaling and the language around scaling that we see. We've come across some terms like scaling out, referring to something like a sort of franchising model, which is similar to the restores with Habitat for Humanity. We've also seen scaling deep, which is sort of deepening the impact you're already having in a community. And we've also seen transformative scale, which Abe has written about, and there's a piece published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So Abe, I was wondering if you could shed some light on what's meant by this term, transformative scale, and what the important nuances that are brought out by this term are.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Patricia. So the concept of transformative scale is rooted in this idea that we started by speaking about, which is that although we've made much progress in the sector, over the last 20 years, we've figured out what works, how it's effective, and we've been able to replicate it in different places, different contexts. There still exists this huge gap between the magnitude of our impact and the tremendous need that exists in the world today. And so the work we've been trying to do is focused on this challenge of how do we bridge that divide? How do we actually start working to solve problems, or to have impact at a magnitude that's commensurate with the needs. So the shorthand we're using is kind of impact at a transformative scale, not just scale for the sake of scale. So what we've found in the work so far is that there are a variety of leaders across the sector, Vanessa and Heidi are just two of them, that have experiments underway to try and answer this challenge. And it's not to say that anyone has really cracked the nut yet, at least in a broad sense, but you see a variety of different experiments that are happening. And so what we're trying to do is kind of codify them and describe them so that hopefully others can learn and build upon the experiences of these trailblazers that are already starting down the path. So what we've found is that, at a broad brush, there are something like 9 different strategies that leaders are taking to try and address this gap between the need that exists and the impact that they're having today. We've broadly grouped these strategies, which, by the way, you can find if you just Google Bridgespan Transformative Scale. There's an article and a really nice blog series that a number of leaders contributed to that help to illustrate and draw this out. But very briefly, the 9 pathways, there are several that are kind of organization-centric, where leaders of organizations can take various actions to help try and scale their impact. And there are some that are field-centric, where it's more about leaders and decision makers and influencers and stakeholders working to try and build a strong field or ecosystem of players that together are adding up to impact at a scale that really matters. So I'll just briefly highlight the different pathways that we've seen, and then we can come back to any in particular that are of interest to the group later on, if that's okay. So the 9 pathways, the first that we've seen is to kind of distribute your model or idea or program through an existing platform. So there are organizations such as the YMCA in the United States. 80% of people in the US live within 5 miles of a YMCA facility. So if you can take your codified model or idea and distribute it through this existing platform, it can spread much quicker and much more effectively and at a much lower cost than if you try and build your own organization that has the same kind of reach and scale. The second pathway that we've seen is recruiting and training other organizations to deliver your program or to help implement your idea or approach at a scale basis. So similar idea, just a variety of different players that you're working with instead of one single unitary entity. The third that we've seen is unbundling your idea, approach, or program and trying to identify, like, what is the key piece of that is responsible for a disproportionate share of your impact. And then scaling that, because in many cases it's much easier and cheaper to scale a small subsection of what you're trying to do rather than the entire program. And while you may not get the full impact of the entire model, the impact that you get by having such greater scale can often be more than worth that effort. A fifth pathway that we've observed people in the field moving towards is trying to work on building stronger fields. So there's been some research with the Irvine Foundation in the US around a strong fields framework. What does a strong field look like? And what we've seen is this is about kind of both increasing the number of organizations working in a particular field and also strengthening the performance. One example would be in the field of mentoring, something like Big Brothers, Big Sisters might do. There are a set of evidence-based practices about how to gain impact through mentoring programs. In the United States, there are 3,000 different entities implementing mentoring type models across the country, all independent, largely unconnected. And so the idea is, can some set of intermediaries in the field help to raise the performance of all 3,000 of those organizations by promulgating better tools to help them do effective modeling, by doing additional research on the best practices, things of that sort. So building a stronger field. The next pathway we've observed is particularly where you are dealing with a problem that is embedded in an existing public system. Then do things to change or increase the performance of that system, whether it's the education system or the juvenile justice system or the foster care system, that really make a big difference in the outcomes achieved by that system. The systems are often at scale, but maybe not having impact at scale, or at least as much impact as we would like. The next is policy change, and there are two types of flavors to this. So policy change can mean the very classic obtaining government funding to promulgate and spread and scale the particular model that you're working on. It could also mean, however, changing a particular regulation at the federal policy or the local policy level that makes a big difference in terms of the outcomes achieved. So mandating that a parole officer pursue community-based solutions before pursuing incarceration-based solutions for a certain subset of violations, when the research has shown that that actually leads to much better outcomes both for the individual and for the community at large. The next experimental pathway that we've observed is around using markets, leveraging markets. So the social enterprises are a perfect example of this. How can you use a for-profit model to actually scale your impact much more dramatically? Maybe the most famous worldwide example, although controversial, is microfinance and what they've been able to do to achieve scale with their particular incorporation model. The final pathway I'll highlight is around altering the attitudes, behaviors, or social norms of individuals. And these would be things like programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, or movements to help gain acceptance of same-sex marriages, or to increase the utilization of designated drivers across society. So this is another kind of pathway that we've seen people pursuing for certain classes of problems. So again, 9 pathways, experimental strategies that people are pursuing. We're learning about these all the time, not meant to be an exhaustive list, and some leaders are pursuing multiple of these at the same time. So very much look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you. There's definitely a lot there, and I think we can have that article posted on the Google Hangout page. We have some social media happening in the background, so for anyone that wants more on that, that'll be there. It'd be interesting to go into some of the aspects around partnerships. and this idea of collective impact. I'm going to actually read another short excerpt, if Michelle can pull this up. This one is an article written by the founder and CEO of an organization called Year Up. His name is Gerald Chertavian, and he writes, "Our bets shouldn't be on scaling just Year Up or any other individual organization. They should be on establishing proof points, forging strong partnerships, and changing social norms across multiple sectors to drive real collective impact. There's no limit to what we can achieve, though, once we stop worrying about who gets the credit. Year Up will never be the answer on its own, no matter how big we get, because scaling impact is much bigger than scaling an enterprise. Scaling impact requires being humble enough to know we can't do it alone." David, I know that in your work, you're often at this intersection of cross-sectoral collaboration with the nonprofit, for-profit sectors, and also with governments. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about where you see opportunities for this kind of collaboration to scale up collective impact, and also maybe how these collaborations can be enabled more.
Sure. It's really, you know, I was very interested in Abe's points and the excerpt from the SSRI article that you quoted and that I will be eventually quoting here as we go along. But it seems to me that everybody's saying the same thing. I don't think anyone believes that nonprofit social enterprise on its own is going to come anywhere close to solving the social and environmental issues we face. I don't think anybody believes that, or if they do, you know, I need to buy whatever it is that they might possibly be smoking. And so I don't think anyone believes that business is going to solve these problems. And governments, whether they're municipal, state or provincial or federal governments, you know, the one consistent theme is nobody has any money. And nobody expects that they have more money, in particular for social programs. So you look at the existing landscape and you say, okay, government can't fix it. Business isn't going to fix it. The charitable nonprofit sector can't fix it. So what do we got left? Well, you know, the only hope we have, and this is a theme that I think we've heard throughout the thing, is that until you figure out how to collaborate, we're talking about the Restore and Medicine Hat, they found a person from the private sector who they could work with, who would help them get a preferable deal with a landlord who's, I'm guessing, a commercial or for-profit organization, so they could help meet their social mission. So it becomes this, by virtue of the conversation, becomes a collaborative process. Most of the issues that we all deal with are you know, dare I say, motherhood type issues. Who can argue that, you know, not having hungry people in your community, or having well-educated children, or you know, an environment that's safe for our grandchildren, nobody's going to say that those are bad things. When we talk about all these issues on a high level, it doesn't matter whether you're from government or from the private sector or from the charitable sector you're in. So the question becomes, and I think maybe the conversation needs to move from that absolute truth, I believe it to be an absolute truth, to more, how do you do it? So Abe listed some of the things, and you know, that he thinks about it, and I was going to sort of take a stab at some of it, and it's to be honest, it's not that dissimilar. So, you know, it seems to me that some kind of network or multi-stakeholder partnership is just one of the preconditions or prerequisites for scale, and regardless of whatever model gets used. You know, and there are, admittedly, you know, a wide and varied range of models in practice. I mean, and I think Abe sort of identified 9. But so I think the thing is, it's important to ask the question, though, that what kind of networking leads to broad-based impact? And so there's a piece called Forces for Good, the 6 Practices of High-Impact Nonprofits. And it's a study of 12 successful nonprofits in the U.S. Abe, you may be familiar with it. And it included a review of their leadership, their government strategies, programs, fundraising, marketing, all the sort of the regular stuff that we all would think about. What they discovered in this research sort of ran counter to conventional wisdom. The thing that differentiated these high-impact nonprofit organizations didn't have as much to do with building a great organization and expanding it as it did, but you know, their work with and through organizations and individuals outside their own structure. Because the only way they could create meaningful and broader sort of impact was to build on those relationships, to become networkers and collaborators and build those relationships. So they built social movements and social fields, and those high impact nonprofits transformed business and government and other nonprofits and individuals as they worked with them. And they helped to change the world around them. This I'm quoting an article from McLeod, Grant, and Crutchfield in 2007. It's really, I would say that's my experience. When we find ways to work together, change happens, and it can happen really quite quickly. They argued that the vast majority of nonprofit literature focuses on issues that, although they're important, don't determine really whether an organization has impact. So, yes, there has to be good management. Does it have to be perfect? No, and it's sort of that law of diminishing returns. You can continue to improve your management model, but your return on every sort of iteration of the model becomes less, most likely. You can only probably 90% or 80% perfect and devoting your efforts on collaborating is probably better than trying to get 100% perfect management. So things like brand name awareness, breakthrough ideas, mission statements, all those kinds of things, big budgets, all pale in comparison to an organization's ability to collaborate and work across sectors. So working outside the boundaries of their organizations help them to manage their own internal operations, because it opened a much wider window. And I think those are important. So the other thing next thing I want to talk about were sort of six practices that they determined that high impact nonprofits use. And so it gets back to the idea of not needing to own the credit for everything that happens. If you really believe in meeting the mission, then meet the damn mission. So serve and advocate. So these organizations started providing great programming, but they became good at both advocacy and service. So it's not enough to just do a thing. You need to be sharing. So they found ways to make markets work. They're able to influence business practices, to build corporate partnerships, and they developed earned income ventures to achieve the social change on a grander scale. So the Environmental Defense Fund in the U.S., for example, began in the 60s as a lobbying group against business. They later worked with corporations to change business processes and become more sustainable. So it's a way of adapting to things that are around. You need to inspire champions. You need to build community support, not only volunteers and donors and advisors for time and money and technical support, but also for emotional zeal and ownership. Champions who provided more than only financial contributions tend to be more vested, and they show ownership in the interventions. When you get the corporate sector onto your boards and onto your advisory committees, they become partners. It's hard for them to escape wanting to be partnered with things that matter. You need to nurture networks and nonprofit networks. You need to, and I think this is really important for scale, is that you need to master the art of adaptation. You need to be able to change, as things develop. So nobody really thinks we're working in the same world. Does anybody remember what was the big virus scare, the Y2K, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that seems like ancient history. The world's changed. So if you built a business model around solving the Y2K problem, you're probably not doing so well these days. So adapt. And again, you need to share leadership. So organizations are, and leaders in particular of organizations tend to be charismatic, but charismatic leaders who are able to scale impact, have to be smart enough to know that they got to share power and leadership in order to be stronger forces for good. So distributing leadership within your organization and throughout the networks is critically important. So now we get on to the review, the article that.
Thank you, David. I'm actually going to have to unfortunately cut you off here because we're getting really close on our time. Okay. Thank you. I want to just quickly see if we can bring in a couple of reflections on a lot of these ideas that you've shared and that Abe has shared around these pathways and some of the best practices. I'm curious, Heidi, we haven't heard from you in a while. What's striking you about some of these ideas and how they apply to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's very interesting to listen to both David and Abe. And when I was actually writing some of these pathways down as quickly as I could as Abe was saying them. And really, it's the diversification of some of these pathways that will contribute to your success. If you just focus on one, it's not going to help with your scale, whichever way you want to go up, or if you want to, like you said, try and do more of an impact. Our approach for the Restore is that it helps sustain the organization. So working with and collaborating with the corporate world and the private, the individuals is extremely important for us in the Restore because they're making the donations. The individuals are also coming in and doing purchases. But for it to be a platform for us to be able to advocate and educate the public about what Habitat's about and how their purchases transform and equate into building homes for low-income families is very emotional for me, and I see just how selling a door can transform into putting a door in a home for someone. So the collaboration, definitely, I think that's the most important thing. We can all call it different things, but yeah, using what is out there and making partnerships and building them. They're not going to happen overnight, but building them and making them stronger so that the impact is there for the future.
Great, thank you. So we've unfortunately already reached our time. Time goes by quickly when we're having fun, but the conversation definitely doesn't end here. David, it would be great to get a link or that excerpt that you wanted to read out to us, and we can add that to the Google Hangout page, and that's where we'd like to have some of this conversation continue. So if there are any additional thoughts or questions that any viewers have, please share them with us. We'd love to hear what struck you about this conversation and where you'd like the conversation to go from here. And on the ENP Canada site, on the news section, there'll be a follow-up piece next week where we'll be gathering some of the knowledge that was shared here. I'd like to give a big thank you to our 4 guests, Abe, David, Vanessa, and Heidi, to Michelle for co-hosting, and to ENP Canada for hosting this conversation. So thank you, and please share your feedback with us.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.